Hey guys, Tosan here with a new updated talent guide for patch 7.3 for Marksmanship Hunter. So of course this is mainly for, arena, but I will show you talent variations for things like RBGs and stuff like that. So let's get right into it. First off, this is the normal talent build that I typically spec by default right here. And I'll also show you the honor talents. This is the default, so if you just want to, commit these things to memory here, this is what I usually queue up as. However, there are some things that you change. The main thing that you will change would be this tier and this tier. So I'll go over each talent one by one though. So for the first tier of talents, you rarely use Lone Wolf, mainly because, yeah, it's a damage increase, but your pet applies a Mortal Strike debuff. If you're using a Bird of Prey, a River Beast, or a Scorpion pet, they apply the Mortal Wounds debuff, or also known as Mortal Strike from the old terminology. But the Mortal Strike is a huge benefit because especially if you're attacking a target that is being healed by, say, a Resto Druid or a Resto Shaman, it's very important because just Earth Shield and Riptide from a Resto Shaman is a lot of healing. Even if the healer is CC'd, that's going to be a lot of healing just from the Earth Shield proccing. It heals for like 500k or something per proc, so it's a lot of healing. So reducing all healing by 25% is pretty huge. So generally you need the pet. There are certain matchups where you can take Lone Wolf, however. A lot of the time against Shadow Priest Wizard Cleave comps, like where you're going to be pillaring a lot and resetting the fight, you're going to engage and then disengage when you know you can't get a kill or force any cooldowns. So a lot of the time against Shadow Priest, I will take Lone Wolf, and it's not because the healing debuff isn't important, it's mainly because against Shadow Priests, it becomes very hard for your healer to keep your team alive when they have the Twist of Fate talent procced all the time. So, for those of you who don't know, Shadow Priests have a talent called Twist of Fate. What it does is, whenever they do damage to a target under 35% health, they get a 20% damage and healing buff that lasts a good amount of time. So what Shadow Priests tend to do is keep your pet dotted and attack your pet and keep it very low on health, so they can constantly get this 20% damage and healing buff, which is huge. It makes their DPS, which is already crazy, go through the roof. So against Shadow Priest Wizard Cleaves like Resto Shaman, Shadow Priest Destrolock, which is very common, or Shadow Priest Boomkin Resto Shaman, these comps you often reset a lot and disengage, and it's very hard for a healer to keep your pet above 35% health. So I'd rather give up the Mortal Strike to make the priest have 20% less damage and healing most of the time. So I think it's worth it in those particular matchups. So, besides those particular Shadow Priest matchups, you don't really take Lone Wolf unless you're playing with a Mortal Strike class. If you're playing with a Warrior or a Windwalker Monk, those class, or an Assassination Rogue, which, isn't really a comp you want to play right now. But if you're ever, for whatever reason, playing with any of those Mortal Strike classes, then you don't need the Mortal Strike from a pet, in which case Lone Wolf is fine. You do give up Roar of Sacrifice in this case, but that's usually not a big deal. It's a pretty minor defensive cooldown. So, besides that, you can either take Careful Aim or Steady Focus. Both are fine, both are pretty weak and marginal, and you won't really notice a difference specking between the two. The next tier of talents, I usually take Lock and Load. Now, I used to take True Aim, but everything feels different now. Our aim shots feel like they're doing less damage overall with how they've reworked the vulnerability. So, Black Arrow and Lock and Load are usually going to be your go-to, and Lock and Load is especially good now because we have this new Ranger's Finesse talent since patch 7.3, and Lock and Load has great synergy with this, with reducing the cooldown of all of your defensive cooldowns. So I generally take Lock and Load. Now you might say, well, isn't Black Arrow a ton of DPS? It's okay, it's not bad DPS, but the thing is hunters usually don't get kills with just constant pressure, so adding a dot to your arsenal isn't that good. Like, it does decent DPS, but usually you're going to get kills by seizing the healer and doing big burst, and Lock and Load lends itself to that much better. Plus, if you get Lock and Load procs, if you're lucky and you get chain procs, it can add extremely high burst, and on top of that, again, synergy with Ranger's Finesse at the same time. And with this Legacy of the Windrunner artifact trait, if you get good RNG, if your Lock and Load's crit and you proc Legacy of the Windrunner, it's crazy damage. So generally I like to run with Lock and Load. Occasionally I'll take Black Arrow if I'm fighting, tankier classes, like if you're going to be hitting a warrior a lot, you can take... Black Arrow's totally viable is the point. They're both very fine and everything, but I mainly like Lock and Load for the burst and for the reduction of my defensive cooldown. So I pretty much always take Lock and Load. If you choose to take Black Arrow, that's usually okay. For the next tier of talents, Post Haste is definitely the best talent. You don't really need to consider the other two. This is useless. I mean, as soon as you do damage, this effect ends, so it's pointless in PvP. This is like for running transmog runs faster or something. Far Strider, I never really tried this talent. I think it has potential. because, you know, you'll crit a pretty good amount, especially if you're playing Sidewinders and you're hitting a bunch of targets. You'll crit a lot of things, and you might reset disengage a lot. It's just really hard to give up the root and snare break and the speed increase from post haste, so generally you always run with post haste. This tier, definitely Patient Sniper. Sentinel's pretty bleh. I mean, I could see this, you know, helping you pad AoE meters in an RBG team fight or something, but there's no real reason to take anything but Patient Sniper. This is just going to buff your consistent damage with your aim shots on your primary target all the time. And then Binding Shot and Wyvern Sting and Camouflage. All of these are viable options depending on what you're doing. If you're playing Thug Cleave with a rogue, you don't need Binding Shot. You don't want to be randomly DRing, you know, your Subtlety rogues stuns, because they're going to be stunning a lot of the time. So Binding Shot is usually not a good option when you're playing with a rogue, right? And even with a Feral, Binding Shot isn't as bad because Ferals don't stun as much as a Subtlety rogue, so you're not going to worry too much about, you know, Binding Shot DR. But for the most part, when you're playing with these stun melee classes, you want to take Wyvern Sting just to have an extra type of CC that isn't going to DR their stuns. Camouflage is also a viable option if you're fighting a team that may want to open on you really hard, like a rogue mage team. So if you're fighting RMP and you have a stun, you know, class on your team, like a rogue or a feral, you could totally take Camouflage, because Wyvern Sting is nice, but it's not mandatory. But I rarely fear an opener on me, so unless you're struggling with openers from something like RMP and you want to hide in stealth until they come out, Camouflage is a good defensive option. But outside of the opener, you rarely get to actually use it, so I typically take Wyvern Sting in that case. So Wyvern Sting or Binding Shot, depending on what you're playing, is a totally good option. I usually take Binding Shot if I'm running with a class like Ret, because they have a, you know, Hodge as their only stun, and they're usually going to put that on the healer so you can trap off of it, so having the extra stun for the DPS targets is handy with Binding Shot. This tier of talents, Volley is really good for BGs and RBGs. It's just a passive AoE damage padding tool, so you can take this in like BG and RBG settings. It's even viable in Arena, but the main reason I don't suggest Volley in Arena is because you might accidentally break a CC. You know, let's say your rogue decides to blind a healer and he didn't tell you in advance and didn't give you a big enough warning. He might blind a healer right next to your kill target and your AoE will break the blind, right? Or you might break one of your traps. Mainly, I don't use it because even though it's probably on par with Murder of Crows overall, it's an AoE that I don't want to have to worry about toggling on and off throughout a match. You know what I mean? It's not so strong that it's worth the added, you know, effort of constantly saying, oh, I'm about to trap this healer, and this guy might, you know, this mage might blink on top of the healer and cause my AoE to break the trap. You don't have to worry about that and toggling it on and off throughout a match. So I would just recommend sticking with Murder of Crows in an arena setting and Volley in BG settings where breaking CC doesn't really matter. For the final tier, mainly Sidewinders and Trick Shot. If you're typically doing single target burst, Trick Shot is really good for increasing your aim shot damage consistently. And, you know, if you're true shotting and pumping aim shot after aim shot, this is going to add a lot of damage in burst. Sidewinder is also good. You could basically play always Trick Shot or always Sidewinders and be fine. You don't really need to optimize and switch between the two, especially if you don't know which matchups which one is better in every matchup. Now that we don't have the Spray and Pray talent reducing Sidewinders, though, Trick Shot gained a little bit of value in that regard. And Sidewinders, they're both really good options. Often I'll take Sidewinders against melee cleaves, just because, especially if you're playing with a Ret, you typically want to take Sidewinders, by the way, because Rets do tons of AoE damage by default. They're just spamming those Divine Storms all the time. So no matter what you're fighting with a Ret, Sidewinders is typically a good option because, you know, let's say you're attacking a Shadow Priest and he disperses and you want to swap to the Warlock or the Boomkin or whatever he's playing with. Well, that target might have been cleaved down by you and your Ret to 70 or 80% health, in which case your swap to him during the defensive cooldown of the other target is going to be much more effective. So if you're playing a cleave heavy comp like with a Ret, that's a good thing to use. I was playing some Shadow Priest Hunter the other day too, and I usually used Sidewinders for the same reason, because my Shadow Priest is typically going to dot every target, and this will help you cleave with your Shadow Priest or Ret or whatever you're playing with that does AoE. Now, if I'm playing with like a Rogue and we're mostly doing single target burst, I typically stick with Trick Shot. But again, you could take one or the other all the time and never switch them, and it's totally okay. But if you're going to just pick one and never switch it, I would probably lean more towards Sidewinders. Alright, now for the Honor Talents. For the Honor Talents, if you're not an Orc, I especially recommend usually taking Gladiator's Medallion. Just to have that extra trinket, you know, that you can time at crucial moments. Like if an RMP is going to dance, stun lock you, and smoke bomb you, you're going to need a trinket. Now I'm a human, so I also have the extra stun trinket, which is nice, but I typically like to have the Medallion. If you're Orc, Relentless has great synergy with the Orc Racial because stuns last such a short duration that you're very unlikely to die in a bomb, even if you don't have a trinket that you can activate in those emergency situations. So Orc Relentless is usually a good combo. If you're playing any other race, I usually recommend the trinket for very good, timing on it. If you have good judgment, this is the best. Adaptation I will often take against Wizard Cleaves that involve Boomkins, mainly because you're going to get Cycloned a lot, and breaking a Cyclone or a Bash from a Boomkin every 1 minute is usually a good idea. The only downside to this is, for one, it might trinket you at a time that is not crucial where you didn't really need it, and they can abuse it. Let's say a Shaman gets a Hex off on you. Even if the Hex is going to break to dot damage instantly, it will proc your adaptation, and then you won't have a trinket. So use this with care, and try not to get hit with things like hexes. If the Shaman plays a Voodoo Totem and instantly hexes you with it, that's going to fuck you over, but most Shamans don't run that, so it's not that big of a deal. But basically, be very choosy when you decide to use adaptation. It's usually not a good idea. Next tier, Quick Shots definitely wins. The other two are pretty bad for obvious reasons. Giving up haste as Marksman Hunter really sucks. The extra haste makes all of your casts faster and reduces your global cooldown, which is nice. So pretty much always stick to Quick Shots. This tier, all of these are viable, and it depends. So this whole talent setup that you see right now is the default that I typically run with, but you will change these sometimes. Against Shadow Priests, for instance, I typically take Dragon Scale Armor. Now you might think, why not dispel the dots every 30 seconds rather than reducing their damage? Well, the problem with that is whenever you feign death with a Vampiric Touch on you, it's going to horror you. Anybody who dispels a VT gets the horror effect, which is going to CC you for like 3 seconds. So that's pretty annoying, and I'd rather just passively reduce. And he's just going to put the dots right back up anyway. So Dragon Scale is typically the best against Shadow Priests. Against UA locks, both are good. Clearing a whole set of dots is nice, but Dragon Scale is also viable against UA locks as well. Against everything else, you pretty much want to take survival tactics, unless you're fighting a melee cleave, in which case Cat-like Reflexes is very good. However, against anything with a Subtlety Rogue, I would highly recommend not using Cat-like Reflexes because they're going to stun lock you and you can't dodge cheap shots. They cannot be dodged or parried. So, and if a rogue shadow steps and kidney shots you from behind, you also can't dodge or parry from behind. We don't have parry, but just in general, it's a general rule. You can't dodge or parry from behind. So any rogue with half a brain is going to either cheap shot you if this is up, or he's going to shadow step kidney shot you from behind, and this is going to be completely useless damage reduction. Whereas if you take survival tactics, at least after you get out of the stun lock, you can feign death and reduce some damage. Survival tactics is the general default. You can take Cat-like Reflexes against melee cleaves that don't have a fuck ton of stuns, and Dragon Scale against Shadow Priests, and sometimes UA locks if you want. Against this is pretty obvious. Usually if there's a DPS caster on the enemy team, Spider Sting is worth it because a 4-second silence is super good against any wizard. And Scorpion Sting is obviously a choice against melee cleaves because there's nothing better, although it never feels like it's a very strong cooldown because it's only physical critical strike, and a lot of melee classes do a lot of magic damage. Like Ret Paladins and DKs, for instance, they may be melee, but they do mostly or a lot of magic damage, so it's not going to be that useful against them. Scorpion Sting is good against things like Subtlety Rogues, or Outlaw Rogues, even though nobody plays that really, Warriors and Windwalkers, all these pure physical melee classes. It's also decent against Ferals, but against other things, it's not that great. Like against DKs, I actually prefer to take Spider Sting because silencing DKs is nice. Viper Sting is pretty good, but of course it's only effective against Resto Shamans if you don't let them get a cast off. It will. I think it works retroactively. If you put a Viper Sting on a Resto Shaman and he already had Earth Shield on the target, I'm pretty sure it will affect the current Earth Shield and Riptides retroactively, although I haven't tested it, and same with Resto Druids. But I mainly only take Viper Sting against Resto Shamans or Resto Druids. It's not that great against other classes. It's okay against Holy Paladins when they play melee wings, because they heal with melee attacks, which means they're not going to cast and remove this debuff. So against the average Holy Paladin with melee wings, it's okay. But any Paladin with half a brain is going to just dispel that poison off of himself and then continue healing. So I pretty much always use Viper Sting against Resto Druids alone and occasionally against Resto Shamans, but usually I'm taking Spider Sting or Scorpion Sting if not. Viper Sting is actually also not bad against Disc Priests because it can reduce their shields, which are instant cast. It's not as good against Holy Priests because they do a lot of casts, but I mean, you can reduce Prayer of Mendings and stuff like that, but it's actually not bad against Disc Priest. But pretty much if Spider or Scorpion Sting are going to be useful in the matchup, I usually prioritize one of those. So generally speaking, from this talent tier, all these talents are viable in their own right, But for the most part, I take TNT just to increase the range on bursting shot and make it a little bit more reliable, because as you know, it's pretty unreliable. But I don't like giving up bursting shot for scatter shot because it's on the same DR. So although it is handy in a lot of situations, I still prefer to have bursting shot so I can do an extra long CC chain on a healer. You can take scatter in some situations, but I can't really tell you what those situations are because I'm going to be honest, I almost never take scatter shot anymore. And then for high explosive trap, I almost never take this in arena. On Blade's Edge against melee cleaves, I'll sometimes take it, so my healer can drag them to like the ramp, and I can knock them down off my healer, and then my healer can, you know, get away from them a little bit more easily. But for the most part, it's also very unreliable. It's not like the old explosive trap. The trigger time is longer. Like when somebody triggers it, you know, a little spiky ball flies up and then blows up like a second later. So the triggering is unreliable and slow, and the radius is very small, and it just straight up doesn't work, or it doesn't work the way you want it to most of the time. So I almost exclusively take high explosive trap in RBGs, where I can, you know, on maps like AB, if you're fighting at Lumber Mill, you can get somebody near the edge and maybe knock them off of Lumber Mill, which is amazing. Or in Eye of the Storm, you can maybe knock a healer off the cliff into the Abyss and help you win a team fight mid and stuff like that. But besides RBGs, I almost never take this because it's just so unreliable. And for the last tier of talents, Sniper Shot is pretty garbage still. So usually you take Ranger's Finesse default. Ranger's Finesse is a really good utility to reduce your defensive cooldowns. This has saved my life numerous times. You know, like, oh, my turtle just came up when I needed it because I shot a bunch of aim shots and reduced the cooldown. So this is pretty much the go-to almost always. You can use True Shot Master if you know a game is going to last a very short duration. If it's like a high-intensity burst game, like RMP versus Thug Cleave or something, where you know the game is only going to last about 2 minutes, then Ranger's Finesse isn't that good. And you can take True Shot Master because maybe, you know, 2 minutes passes and the cooldown comes back up earlier and you can get a kill with the second True Shot. But, you know, besides matchups that you know are going to be very short battles, I typically take Ranger's Finesse. So that's pretty much it for the talents. These are the defaults I go with, and of course, you know, you change sometimes. But yeah, you're just going to have to know these matchups and when you should change these talents. I hope this video has been informative to help you decide which talents to take in which situations. It's pretty hard to cover every possible situation, and you know, hopefully you can figure some out for yourself as you go along. I really hope that this video has been a help to give you guys at least a starting point. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching as always, and peace out.